A relentless snowstorm traps two strangers in a world of isolation and icy winds. In the middle of this chaos, an unexpected act of kindness sets off a series of events that will change everything for both. Will a simple mechanic and a powerful CEO, worlds apart, be able to overcome their differences and find something real? Make sure to comment where you're watching from and subscribe for more. The snowstorm hit hard, just as the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a cloak of darkness. It wasn't the first time David Thompson had driven through such a storm, but this one felt different. It felt heavier. The wind howled as it swept across the desolate highway, the snow thick enough to swallow everything in sight. The headlights of his car barely pierced through the blizzard, and the road seemed like an endless white abyss. Inside the car, David gripped the wheel tightly, trying to keep the vehicle steady. In the back seat, his daughter Lily sat huddled under a blanket, her small frame curled up in a tight ball as she dozed off. At 6 years old, she had inherited her father's calm nature, a trait that had always amazed David. Lily rarely complained, even when the world around her was chaotic. David's thoughts were interrupted by a flicker of light in the distance. It was faint at first, like a weak pulse in the dark. He squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of it. As they neared, he could see the outline of an SUV, its headlights still on, sitting at an odd angle at the side of the road. The car's tires were buried in the snow, and there was no sign of movement. David's heart skipped a beat. Instinct took over. He pulled the car to a stop beside the abandoned SUV, the tires screeching as they fought against the ice. The storm raged on, but the warmth inside the vehicle made him feel momentarily safe. Yet, there was a sense of urgency. He couldn't just drive past and leave someone stranded, especially not in these conditions. David quickly threw the car in park and glanced back at Lily, who was still asleep, her soft breaths rising and falling under the blanket. He could hear the wind howling outside, the noise filling the cabin like a constant, oppressive roar. He didn't want to wake her, didn't want to scare her. He just needed to help. He grabbed his coat, pulled it tightly around himself, and climbed out into the fury of the storm. The cold hit him immediately, searing his skin like 1,000 needles. He pushed forward, moving toward the SUV. As he reached the driver's side, the windows were almost entirely covered in a thick layer of ice. With no time to lose, he punched through the frozen glass, the shards falling like glass rain. He reached inside and found the woman slumped over in the front seat, unconscious and barely breathing. Her skin was pale, her lips tinged blue, and her body was rigid with cold. She wasn't just unconscious, she was freezing. Without hesitation, David carefully pulled her from the car, his arms shaking from the brutal wind, and carried her back to his own vehicle. When he returned to the car, Lily was awake now, staring up at him with wide, confused eyes. "Daddy, who is she?" David didn't have an answer. He just knew he had to help her, no matter who she was. "I don't know, baby," he whispered, "but she's going to be okay. We're going to take care of her." The warmth of the car enveloped them again as David drove on, heading toward home. His small house was a few miles away, isolated by the relentless storm, but it was the only place he knew. He didn't think twice. When they finally arrived, David carefully carried the woman inside and placed her on the couch, covering her with blankets. He went to the kitchen to make a pot of soup, glancing back at her every now and then. Lily sat quietly beside the woman, her small hand resting on her. David couldn't help but wonder who this woman was, what had brought her here, and why she was out alone in a snowstorm. But he didn't dwell on the questions. For now, he would simply do what he could. He would help her. As the storm raged outside, inside his small home, the warmth of a simple act of kindness began to fill the space, and David felt for the first time in a long while that he was doing something right. He couldn't have known then, as he sat by the fire waiting for her to wake, that this woman, this stranger, would change everything. He couldn't have known that their lives, though so different, were about to intertwine in ways that would challenge everything they believed about themselves and the world around them. And as the snowstorm howled outside, David Thompson, the humble mechanic, had no idea that his life, and the life of his daughter Lily, was about to be forever changed. David sat quietly by the fire, his eyes flicking nervously toward the woman resting on the couch. She hadn't moved since he brought her inside, her face still pale and her breathing shallow. The storm outside howled relentlessly, but within the small house, the heat from the fire made the cold seem far away. His daughter Lily, who had been unusually quiet, sat by the woman's side, her tiny hand resting gently on the stranger's. David couldn't help but smile at how tenderly Lily looked after the woman, as if she too understood the weight of what was happening. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, marking the minutes that dragged on. It wasn't long before the woman began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and David leaned forward, his heart racing. She slowly blinked, taking in her surroundings, her eyes widening as confusion washed over her face. Where am I?" Her voice was weak, almost a whisper, but David could hear the strain in it. She tried to sit up but winced, her hand moving instinctively to her head. "Easy now," David said gently, moving closer. "You're safe. You were stranded in the snowstorm, and I brought you here." The woman's gaze flicked around the small living room, taking in the modest surroundings. Her eyes lingered on Lily, who was still watching her with a quiet curiosity. A hint of recognition passed across the woman's face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. She seemed confused, disoriented. I don't remember," she murmured, her voice trailing off. She closed her eyes, trying to focus, but the effort seemed too much for her. David hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "You were trapped in your car. I found you and brought you here." He paused, unsure if she had even registered his words. "What's your name?" The woman took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. When she opened her eyes again, they were clearer, though still distant. "Caroline," she said softly. "Caroline Richards." David's brow furrowed slightly. The name sounded familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Caroline Richards. It wasn't a name he heard every day in his line of work. "Are you someone important?" he asked, the curiosity slipping out before he could stop it. It wasn't a question he normally would have asked, but something about her presence felt out of place here, in this humble home, in the middle of nowhere. Caroline hesitated, then gave a weak, forced laugh. "I suppose you could say that," she replied. "I run a company, an automotive company actually, but right now I'm just someone who's grateful for your kindness." David didn't know what to say to that. He wasn't used to dealing with people who ran big companies. He was just a mechanic, doing what he could to make a living, but he could sense the weight in her voice, the tiredness in her eyes. It was clear that her life was something more complicated than she was letting on. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more conviction, "for helping me. I don't know how I would have survived out there." David nodded, unsure of how to respond. His life was simple, and he liked it that way. He had enough to worry about without adding complications, and yet, here he was, taking care of a woman who was far removed from the life he knew. He glanced at Lily, who was still watching Caroline intently, as if waiting for something more. "Don't mention it," David said, forcing a smile. "We're just glad we could help." But as he said the words, a strange tension filled the room. Caroline seemed lost in thought for a moment, her gaze distant, as though she was far away. David felt a pang of unease. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite place, that made him feel as though he had stepped into a world he didn't understand. Caroline shifted slightly on the couch, her eyes flicking between David and Lily. "I can't stay here forever," she said softly. "I have to get back. I don't know how long the storm will last, but I need to go back to my life." David's stomach tightened at her words. He had expected her to want to leave eventually, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel real. She was a stranger. She didn't belong in his home, and he knew that deep down. But part of him didn't want her to leave. Part of him was drawn to the vulnerability he saw in her, the fragility behind her confident exterior. "Of course," he said, keeping his voice steady. "We'll figure out what to do once the storm clears up." Caroline nodded, though she didn't seem convinced. She stared into the fire for a long time, lost in thought. The quiet stretched between them, thick and heavy. David's mind raced, wondering what the future held. He had no expectations from her. After all, she had her own life, her own world far removed from his own. Yet, something lingered in the air, an unspoken connection that neither of them could ignore. As the hours passed and the storm raged on outside, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something far more complicated than he could have ever imagined. He didn't know who Caroline Richards really was, or what she was running from, but something told him that her arrival at his doorstep that night was no accident. The storm didn't let up. Outside, the wind continued to howl like an angry beast, clawing at the walls of the small house. But inside, there was a fragile stillness that had settled over everything. David sat at the kitchen table, his fingers tapping lightly on the worn wood as he stared out the window. Lily was in the other room, coloring quietly, her innocence a stark contrast to the heavy thoughts swirling in his head. Caroline had been resting for hours, and though she was awake, she hadn't spoken much since their last conversation. It was clear that something weighed heavily on her. David had always prided himself on his ability to read people, but Caroline Richards was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Her powerful exterior, the CEO of a major company, seemed so far removed from the woman he had helped save that night. And yet, beneath that tough, business-like facade, there was something fragile, something broken. It wasn't the kind of brokenness he was used to seeing, the kind born out of poverty or desperation. No, it was something else. After a few moments, he heard the soft shuffle of feet behind him. Caroline had gotten up from the couch and made her way into the kitchen, her steps slow and deliberate. She looked better than she had before, but the exhaustion still clung to her, evident in the shadows under her eyes. "You don't have to do all this," she said, her voice softer than before. "I can manage on my own. I just need to figure things out." David turned to face her, taking in her weary posture. He didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say. The weight of her words was obvious. She was struggling with something, though she hadn't fully opened up about it. "You're not alone here," David said finally, his voice calm but firm. "We'll get through this together. The storm will pass, and then you'll be on your way. But for now, you rest. That's what's important." Caroline met his gaze for a long moment, and then her shoulders slumped. She seemed to deflate, the tension in her body giving way to something deeper, something she had been holding inside. "I don't know how to do that," she whispered. "Rest, I mean." David frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. He could tell that her struggle was more than just the physical exhaustion from the storm. There was a deeper ache in her voice, something that tugged at him, something he couldn't ignore. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" he asked gently, standing up from the table. He hadn't meant to push, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was carrying something far heavier than the cold. "You don't have to keep it inside. Not here." Caroline hesitated, her fingers brushing against the back of the chair as though seeking support. For a long while, she didn't speak. Her eyes stared into the distance, and David knew, even without her words, that she was fighting something she didn't want to let anyone see. "My life," Caroline finally said, her voice strained. "It's not what people think it is." She paused, and when she spoke again, her words were laced with bitterness. "I've spent so much time building this empire, this thing that's supposed to make me happy, but it's all just empty. I'm empty." David remained silent, watching her carefully, letting the quiet of the room settle around them. He could hear Lily in the next room humming softly to herself, blissfully unaware of the emotional weight that hung in the air. It was moments like this, moments of raw honesty, that made David feel the distance between him and the world Caroline came from. "I don't know how to fix it," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "I don't know how to fix myself. Everything I've done, it's all just so I don't feel alone. But I do. I always do." David's heart tightened at the vulnerability in her voice. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before. The powerful CEO reduced to someone who didn't have all the answers, someone who was just trying to hold it all together. The contrast was striking, and for a moment David saw her not as the successful businesswoman, but as a person who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "You don't have to have all the answers," David said quietly, his voice steady. "Sometimes all you need is to stop running for a little while." Caroline looked at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read him. There was a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe fear in her gaze. "I've been running from myself for so long," she murmured, almost to herself. "I don't know how to stop." David walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain slightly, peering out into the storm. The wind still raged, the snow piling higher with every passing moment. It was the kind of storm that made everything feel distant, made time slow down. But David knew that the storm outside wasn't the only thing that needed to clear. Caroline's storm was inside her, and it was one that had been raging far longer than this one. "You don't have to do it alone," David said, his voice quiet but filled with a kind of quiet strength. "We all have our storms, but we don't have to face them alone." Caroline was silent for a long moment, as if letting the weight of his words settle in. Then, to David's surprise, she took a step toward him, her expression softer, the walls she'd been holding up starting to crumble. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to explain how much I needed to hear that." David nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly in a quiet smile. Sometimes a little kindness can go a long way. Just then, Lily appeared in the doorway, her wide eyes watching them with innocent curiosity. "Are you feeling better, lady?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful. Caroline smiled faintly, her eyes softening as she looked at the little girl. "I'm feeling a lot better, thank you." Lily grinned and walked over to her, sitting down next to Caroline. The small gesture was enough to bring a tear to Caroline's eye, but she quickly wiped it away, not wanting to show weakness in front of the child. David watched the two of them, his heart heavy with a mixture of sadness and hope. It was strange. this connection that had begun so unexpectedly. But something told him that, despite all the differences between him and Caroline, something real was starting to form. And maybe, just maybe, it could be enough to change everything for both of them. But for now, as the storm outside continued to rage, they all shared a quiet moment of peace. It was enough to remind them that sometimes, in the midst of the fiercest storms, we can find a quiet place to heal. The storm was still relentless, but as the days passed, the tension in the small house began to shift. The quiet between David and Caroline, once thick and uncomfortable, started to dissipate. Though they still came from vastly different worlds, there was a silent understanding growing between them, a bond formed out of necessity, kindness, and something deeper that neither was ready to name. David had always believed in the simplicity of life. He worked hard, took care of his daughter, and rarely asked for help. His world was practical and grounded, with little room for pretense or grand ambitions. Caroline, on the other hand, had spent her entire life building an empire, stacking success upon success, only to find herself standing alone at the top. The stark difference between their lives was impossible to ignore, but over the last few days, David began to see that, despite their contrasting circumstances, they were both searching for something more. Caroline was quieter now, more withdrawn than she had been on that first night. She still hadn't fully explained what was happening in her life, but David could see it in the way her eyes seemed to look past him, like she was struggling with something she couldn't put into words. She spent most of her time resting, sitting by the fire, and occasionally joining Lily for a quiet game or conversation. But David knew that she was still carrying something heavy, a burden that was gnawing at her from the inside. One evening, as David worked on a repair in the small garage attached to the house, Caroline ventured out to join him. The garage was simple, filled with the scent of oil and metal, a stark contrast to the polished, high-tech world she was used to. She stood at the doorway for a moment, watching him work. He didn't notice her presence at first, too focused on tightening a bolt. "Need help with that?" Caroline's voice broke the silence, and David looked up, surprised to see her standing there. For a moment, he just stared at her, unsure of how to respond. She was dressed simply in jeans and a sweater, her hair tied back loosely. No makeup, no power suit, just a woman trying to fit in where she didn't belong. He was used to seeing her as the CEO, the woman who commanded boardrooms and made deals, but this version of Caroline, the one standing in the doorway of his humble garage, felt like a different person altogether. "I could use an extra hand, but I'm not sure if this is your kind of thing," David said with a small, half-hearted laugh. Caroline smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing for a moment. "I've done my share of car repairs," she said, stepping forward. "Maybe not on this scale, but I know my way around an engine." David raised an eyebrow. "I'm not sure if I believe you," he teased, though there was no malice in his voice. It was the first time he had seen her laugh, even if it was just a small chuckle. "Well, don't expect me to fix it in one go," Caroline replied with a grin, "but I can give it a try." She stepped closer and watched as David finished what he was doing, handing her a tool and showing her where to start. It was a simple task, but the gesture of her helping felt important. There was something humbling in her willingness to try something new, to step into a world so different from her own, even if it was just for a moment. As they worked together, David couldn't help but notice the way Caroline's hands moved with precision, the same careful focus she likely brought to her business dealings. Despite the differences in their backgrounds, he saw a common thread between them. Both of them were driven. Both of them had to work hard to get to where they were. But the question lingered in the air. Had their hard work ever really brought them the peace they longed for? "So what made you leave everything behind?" David asked, his voice quieter now. He wasn't sure if he should be prying, but the question had been weighing on him. Caroline didn't answer immediately, her hands pausing in their work as she seemed to gather her thoughts. For a moment, she just stared at the engine, the sound of the storm outside, the only thing filling the silence. "I didn't leave it behind," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'm still there, but it doesn't feel like mine anymore. I've built this life, this world of meetings and deals, but somewhere along the way, I lost who I was. I thought I needed more money, more power, but none of it gave me what I really wanted." David could feel the weight in her words, the sadness that hovered just beneath the surface. He didn't say anything right away, unsure of how to respond. The world Caroline had built for herself seemed so far removed from his, so distant from the simple life he had, and yet they both seemed to be searching for the same thing: peace, connection, purpose. "I never thought I'd end up here," Caroline continued, her voice quieter now, "in this little house with a stranger, but I don't know what I expected. My whole life I've been running after things. Goals, success, all of that. But none of it ever really filled the emptiness. David nodded slowly. He didn't know what it felt like to have everything and still feel empty, but he understood the feeling of yearning. He understood the desire for something more than just survival. Maybe you've been running after the wrong things, David said, his voice quiet but firm. Sometimes, the more we chase, the further we get from what really matters. Caroline met his gaze, her eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. And what matters to you, David? She asked, her tone soft. David paused for a moment, looking down at the tools in his hands. What matters to me is keeping my daughter safe, keeping her happy, making sure she has everything she needs. He shrugged, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's all I need. Caroline studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. She seemed to be processing his words, considering them in a way that she hadn't before. David wasn't sure if she was learning something about herself or if she was simply trying to make sense of everything. For a while, they worked in silence, the only sounds in the garage the clinking of tools and the hum of the storm outside. The connection between them, though fragile, was growing, and both of them knew it. It was a connection built on understanding, on the shared realization that they were both looking for something they hadn't been able to find in their own worlds. Maybe, just maybe, they could help each other find it. As they finished the task, Caroline stepped back and looked at David with a quiet smile. Thanks, she said, for everything. David gave her a small nod. Anytime, he replied. We're in this together. And though neither of them fully understood what the future held, something had changed. They were no longer strangers. They were two people trying to make sense of their worlds, leaning on each other in the quiet storm that surrounded them. The storm outside was finally beginning to subside. The wind, which had screamed relentlessly for days, now only whispered softly through the trees. The snow was still thick on the ground, but the worst had passed. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the silence inside the house felt comfortable, no longer oppressive, but peaceful. David had been up early, checking on the repairs he had done to his car, making sure it was ready for the roads to clear. Lily had already started playing with her toys, lost in her own world, while Caroline sat by the fire, her gaze distant as she stared into the flickering flames. It had been days since their conversation in the garage, and though the quiet had settled between them, there was an unspoken tension. David could sense it, just as he could feel the weight of Caroline's thoughts pressing on her. She hadn't spoken much since then, and though she was more present in the house, her mind seemed to be elsewhere. David wasn't sure what it was that had brought Caroline to his doorstep that night, but he could see her struggling. She was trying to reconcile the world she had built with the life she was now living in his small home. Her desire to fix things with her company, her image of success. It all felt so distant now, like something that didn't fit her anymore. But what could he do? She was still carrying the burden of a life that, by all appearances, had everything, and yet it seemed to be suffocating her. It was late afternoon when Caroline finally spoke again. She had come into the kitchen while David was preparing some soup for dinner. Her voice was tentative, as though testing the waters. "I've been thinking about something," she began, her tone quieter than usual. David turned, his hands still covered in flour as he kneaded the dough for bread. "What's that?" he asked, pausing for a moment to look at her. Caroline took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she stood in the doorway. "I want to help you," she said, her voice filled with uncertainty. David furrowed his brow, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Help me?" he asked, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Caroline continued, her gaze steady, "you've done so much for me. You've helped me in ways I can't even begin to repay. And I feel like I should do something in return. I'm not just talking about money or things like that. I want to do something that actually helps, something that can make a difference." David wiped his hands on a cloth and walked over to the counter, leaning against it as he studied Caroline. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, the determination to make a change that went beyond the material things she had known. It was clear she was struggling with her own identity, but this was the first time she had openly expressed a desire to make a difference that wasn't tied to her power or success. "What do you have in mind?" David asked cautiously. Caroline hesitated as though unsure how to continue. "I have a company, right?" she began slowly, her voice growing more confident. "And part of that company is looking for mechanics who can handle high-end repairs, work on luxury cars, things like that. I've been thinking, maybe I could offer you a contract. You could work with my company, and I'll make sure you get fair pay. You wouldn't have to worry about business stuff, just focus on the work itself." David blinked, taken aback by the offer. He had heard the words, but they didn't seem to register immediately. He had never been one for big contracts, especially not with someone from a world so different from his. This was Caroline Richards, the CEO of a major company, a world apart from his own modest mechanic shop. "You want me to work with your company?" David asked slowly, trying to wrap his mind around it. "You're offering me a contract?" Caroline nodded, but the uncertainty was still there. "I know it's a big leap," she said quickly, "but I think you'd be good at it, and it would give you the opportunity to grow your business. I want to help you, David. I want to give you an opportunity that could make a real difference." David stood still for a moment, his heart pounding as he considered her offer. The more he thought about it, the more the idea seemed too complicated. He had never wanted to climb the corporate ladder, never wanted to rely on anyone else to take care of him. And yet, here was Caroline, offering something that could change his life. But there was more to it than just the offer itself. David wasn't sure he could trust it, trust her. He had spent his life living simply, never reaching for anything more than he needed, never depending on anyone else. And now, Caroline wanted him to depend on her. It felt like too much, too soon. "I don't know," David said, shaking his head. "I don't know if I can accept this. It feels like I'd be giving up something important if I did. I don't want to be beholden to anyone." Caroline's face softened, and she took a step toward him. "I get it," she said gently. "I really do. You're proud, and you've done everything yourself. But David, this isn't about charity. It's about giving you a chance to do what you do best, and get paid what you deserve for it." David looked down at his hands, unsure of what to say next. Part of him wanted to refuse. It would be easier, he thought, to keep his life simple, to stay in the world he knew. But there was another part of him that saw Lily's bright eyes, that dreamed of a better future for her, a future that didn't rely on him scraping by. He wanted more for her, and maybe, just maybe, this was the chance he needed to give her that future. But was he willing to take the leap? Was he ready to step into a world that didn't feel like his own? The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of his indecision. Caroline was watching him, her face soft with patience, giving him the space to make up his mind. Finally, David spoke, his voice low but steady. "I need some time to think about it." Caroline nodded, understanding. "Of course, no rush." As she turned to leave, David felt the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He had a choice to make, one that would change everything for him, for Lily, and maybe even for Caroline. But the question was, could he trust this offer? Could he trust her? The answer wasn't clear, and he knew it wasn't going to be easy. But sometimes, David realized, the hardest part wasn't taking the first step. It was deciding whether or not you were ready to take it. The days following Caroline's offer felt longer than they were. The storm had cleared, but a new kind of pressure hung over David, one that was far more subtle, yet far more intense. Every corner of his small house felt heavy with the weight of the decision he needed to make. He had always been a man of routine, simple, predictable, steady. His life had never demanded more than what he could provide with his hands and his heart. But now, Caroline had thrown him a lifeline, a chance to grow, to rise above the limitations of his small garage and make something bigger for Lily. But what did that really mean? To accept her offer would be to step into a world that had always felt foreign to him. The corporate world, the world of wealth and status, was not a place he had ever aspired to be. It wasn't that he didn't admire success. It was just that he had always believed in the value of hard work and self-sufficiency. To depend on someone like Caroline, no matter how genuine her offer was, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Every time he looked at Lily, who had been unusually quiet herself, a pang of guilt filled his chest. She deserved more. She deserved a future where she didn't have to worry about the struggles David had faced. But did that future have to come at the expense of his own independence? That night after dinner, David sat alone at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The quiet hum of the house seemed louder now, filled with the weight of his thoughts. Caroline had given him time, but how much time did he really have? He wasn't a young man anymore, and opportunities like the one Caroline offered didn't come around every day. He wanted to do the right thing, for Lily, for himself. But what was the right thing? Lily's voice broke his reverie as she entered the kitchen, her small feet padding quietly against the floor. She had a drawing in her hand, her face lit up with the joy of creating something. "Look, Daddy," she said, holding up her picture for him to see. David forced a smile and leaned forward to examine it. It was a simple drawing, stick figures, a small house, a car, but the image made his heart ache. She had drawn the house they lived in, the garage where he worked, the life they shared. It was a life full of love, of warmth, but it was also a life full of struggle. "This is beautiful, Lily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've got a real talent for this." Lily beamed, her eyes full of the unspoken pride of a child sharing her world with someone she loved. "Can we put it on the fridge?" she asked, her little face filled with hope. "Of course," David replied, standing up to get a magnet. As he stuck the drawing on the refrigerator, he glanced at it again, his mind racing. Was this the life he wanted for her? Was this enough? "Daddy, are you okay?" Lily asked, her voice quiet, her small hand resting gently on his arm. David knelt down to her level, his eyes softening. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just thinking about some things." "You're thinking about Miss Caroline, aren't you?" Lily asked, her voice surprisingly perceptive for a 6-year-old. David blinked, surprised. "How did you know?" Lily shrugged. "You've been talking a lot about her. You don't have to worry. She's nice. She helped us." David's heart tightened at her words. Caroline had helped them, yes, but that wasn't the only thing he was struggling with. "I'm not worried about her, Lily. I'm just trying to figure out what's best for us." Lily tilted her head, considering his words for a moment. "I think you should do what makes you happy. And if Miss Caroline can help us, then that's good. You always say we should help people, right?" David smiled softly, the weight in his chest easing for a brief moment. His daughter, wise beyond her years, had spoken the truth without realizing it. He had always believed in helping others, in doing what was right, but now he was the one who needed to accept help. Maybe that was what he needed to learn, to stop carrying the weight of everything on his shoulders alone. "I'll think about it, okay?" David said, running a hand through her hair. "I promise." Lily nodded, satisfied, and skipped back to her room to continue her drawing. David watched her go, the quiet realization settling in. She was right. Helping others was important, but so was allowing yourself to be helped when you needed it. That night, after Lily had gone to bed, David sat on the couch, staring at the fire that crackled in the hearth. Caroline's offer loomed in his mind like a shadow, but something had shifted in him. He wasn't just thinking about the future. He was thinking about what he could give Lily. A better life, a more stable future. He had worked hard for everything they had, but maybe it was time to let someone else help him build that future. The phone rang, pulling David from his thoughts. He hesitated before picking it up, not recognizing the number on the screen. "Hello? David, it's Caroline," came the voice on the other end, steady but warm. "I just wanted to check in and see if you'd had time to think about my offer." David sat back on the couch, running a hand over his face. "I've been thinking a lot, Caroline, about what you said, and I think I'm ready to talk." There was a brief pause on the other end, as though Caroline was holding her breath. "I'm glad to hear that." David's heart raced, but there was a calm in his voice when he spoke next. "I'm not sure where this will take me, but I'm willing to try, for Lily's future, and maybe for mine too." Caroline's voice softened, filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "David, I promise you won't regret it. I'll make sure this is a partnership, not a burden. We'll make it work." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Thank you. Let's see where it goes." As he hung up the phone, David sat in the silence that followed, the weight of his decision lifting slightly from his shoulders. He had made his choice. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't what he had envisioned for himself, but it was the right choice. For Lily, for their future. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, David felt like he was walking toward something, not running away from it. The days after David made his decision were filled with a quiet kind of anticipation. It wasn't the dramatic shift he had expected. Rather, it was a slow, steady change. Caroline's offer was now more than just words. It was a tangible opportunity that could reshape everything. The weight of it hadn't yet fully settled, but it was becoming real. Day by day, David had accepted the offer. And as the days turned into weeks, he found himself faced with the reality of what that decision meant. He had agreed to work with Caroline's company, but that didn't mean everything would be easy. The idea of stepping into a new world, a world of high expectations, contracts, and board meetings, felt strange to him. His life had been grounded in the simplicity of working on cars, of fixing things with his own 2 hands. But now, things were changing. Slowly, he started making preparations to shift his focus, to grow his business in a way he had never imagined before. Caroline had been as good as her word. She didn't push him. She gave him the time he needed to adjust, to get comfortable with the idea of working together. She even arranged for her company to help with a small loan to expand his workshop, to invest in tools and equipment that could make the business more efficient. David was overwhelmed at first, but he knew that the loan, though small in comparison to the sums Caroline dealt with every day, was a step forward. He was still trying to reconcile it with his sense of self, his pride, his desire to do things on his own. But the practicality of it was undeniable. He had to think about the future. He had to think about Lily. Lily seemed to understand the shift, even if David hadn't fully figured it out himself. She was happy, always happy, but there was a quiet curiosity in her, an awareness of the changes that were happening around her. She often asked when Caroline would be back to visit, always eager to see her, to show off her latest drawings or little projects she was working on. The bond between the two of them had formed quickly. It wasn't just gratitude. There was something more. Caroline had come into their lives when they needed her most, and Lily, with her innocent wisdom, recognized that. One morning, a few weeks after David had agreed to work with Caroline's company, they had a meeting scheduled. Caroline was driving to the garage, a business meeting of sorts, to discuss the next steps. David stood in the garage, wiping his hands on a rag as he checked the tools, mentally preparing for the conversation. He wasn't nervous anymore, but he was still cautious. This wasn't just a meeting about business. It was about trust, about forging a new partnership with someone who had the power to change his life forever. When Caroline arrived, she was dressed in her usual business attire, but there was a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there when he first met her. She stepped out of the car, glancing around the workshop, taking in the simple, no-frills environment. "I've always loved the smell of a garage," Caroline said, smiling as she walked up to him. "It's something you can't replicate in a corporate office." David couldn't help but smile back. "It's the smell of hard work," he replied, gesturing to the various tools and equipment around the room. Caroline nodded. "Exactly. That's why I wanted you to be part of this. You know what it means to do the work, to get your hands dirty. Not everyone in my world understands that." David studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "I know what it's like to be surrounded by people who don't understand your life, but you don't have to apologize for what you've built, Caroline. You've worked hard for it." Her smile faltered slightly and she looked away, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing her face. "I know," she said quietly, "but I can't help but wonder if it was all worth it. I've spent so much of my life chasing success, but I've never felt fulfilled. Not like this." David didn't know what to say. He understood her struggle more than she realized. He had always chased stability, always fought for survival. Success hadn't been the driving force for him. It had been about providing for Lily, about creating a life for her that was better than the one he had grown up with. But Caroline had spent her life in pursuit of success, and now she was questioning it. Maybe, in her own way, she was searching for something more than what she had achieved. They stood in silence for a long moment, both of them lost in their thoughts. Finally, David broke the quiet. "Look, I'm ready to move forward with this. I'm not sure what the future holds, but I know that I can't do it alone, and I know you want to help. I trust you." Caroline's eyes softened, and she took a step closer to him. "You're not alone in this, David. We're doing this together, and I'm going to make sure you get the chance to build something that matters." David nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He had made a choice, to trust her, to trust the future they were building together. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be without its challenges, but it was the right choice. He had made it for Lily, for their future. And maybe, just maybe, he was making it for himself, too. As Caroline began to explain the next steps in the business plan, David listened carefully, his mind working through the details. It was a new world for him, but it was a world he was willing to step into. He wasn't sure where it would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. It was a path that was leading them toward something better. And, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was walking forward, not just surviving, but truly living. The next day, as David worked on the new car repairs in the garage, a thought crossed his mind. He had made a decision, and now it was time to embrace the changes that were coming. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it, alongside Caroline, alongside Lily. For the first time, the weight on his shoulders didn't feel like a burden. It felt like the beginning of something new. The months that followed David's decision were a blur of changes, both big and small. The new business venture, though still in its early stages, had already begun to show promise. The loan from Caroline's company had allowed him to upgrade the garage, buying new equipment and investing in tools that would make his work more efficient. Slowly but surely, the reputation of his shop started to grow. He was still David Thompson, the mechanic who worked with his hands and had a heart full of integrity. But now, he was something more. He was a small business owner, a partner in a larger venture, one that would provide a better future for him and Lily. Caroline had been true to her word. She didn't just provide financial support, she helped him navigate the complexities of running a business at a higher level. The meetings, the paperwork, the logistics, it was all foreign to David, but Caroline's calm, steady guidance made it manageable. As time went on, the partnership between them began to feel less like a business transaction and more like a real connection. They started to understand each other, not just as business partners, but as people with their own scars, struggles, and dreams. For Caroline, the changes were just as significant. Though she was still deeply involved in her company, she began to step back, to reevaluate what mattered most in her life. The relentless pursuit of power and success had left her exhausted, hollow. But working alongside David, seeing the simple way he approached life, his focus on what was real, on what mattered, had begun to shift her perspective. She had begun to spend more time with Lily, and she started to recognize something in herself that had long been missing, the ability to care for someone without expecting anything in return. It was a kind of fulfillment she had never known, but one she now realized was far more meaningful than any business deal or financial achievement. One evening, after another long day of work, David sat on the porch, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. It was a peaceful moment, the kind he had always longed for, but never quite seemed to reach until now. Lily was inside, helping Caroline bake cookies, laughing as they worked together. It was a small moment, but it filled David's heart in a way nothing else could. Caroline walked out to join him, her face soft with the exhaustion of the day, but also with something more, a quiet sense of contentment. "Beautiful evening," Caroline said, sitting beside him on the steps. "I never really noticed how peaceful it is out here. It's a far cry from the city." David smiled. "Yeah, it's a different kind of life. It's slower, but there's a kind of peace in that." "I think I'm starting to understand that," Caroline replied, her voice thoughtful. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." David turned to look at her, a little surprised by her words. He had always known Caroline was driven, but he had never expected her to reflect so openly on her life. "What do you mean?" "I've spent so much of my life chasing after things I thought would make me happy," Caroline said, her gaze steady on the horizon. "I built this empire, this world where everything was about success and control, but in the end, it never really made me feel fulfilled. It never made me feel like I was part of something real." She looked at him, her eyes softer now. "What you've built here, this life, your family, this small business, it's real. And I've learned that what really matters isn't the size of your success, but the connections you make, the lives you touch. And I feel like I've found that with you and Lily." David felt a lump rise in his throat. It was the first time Caroline had ever really said it, that she wasn't just grateful for his help, but that she had found something in him, in their partnership, that was more important than anything she had accomplished on her own. "I'm glad you're here," David said quietly, his voice full of sincerity. "I'm glad you stayed. I never expected this life with you, with us, but it's better than I ever imagined." Caroline smiled softly, her hand resting on his for a brief moment. "I never expected it either, but sometimes the best things happen when you least expect them." They sat together in silence for a while, the kind of quiet that was comfortable, that needed no words. And as they watched the last rays of sunlight fade away, David realized that their lives, though so different from one another, had come together in a way that was perfectly right. As the days went by, their lives continued to evolve. David's business flourished. Caroline's role in the company shifted as she began to focus more on what truly mattered to her, spending time with people who cared, helping those who were willing to grow, and continuing to support David and Lily. And though they still had their differences, they had found something real, something worth building. David had come a long way since that fateful night in the snowstorm. He had been a man who never expected more than what he had, content with the small world he had built with Lily. But now, his world was expanding. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about thriving, about creating a life that was full of love, of meaning, and of purpose. And in the end, it was about understanding that success wasn't defined by wealth or power. It was defined by the people who walked beside you, by the love you shared, and by the impact you made on the world around you. As the night grew darker, David smiled to himself, knowing that no matter what the future held, he was no longer just surviving. He was living. And for the first time in his life, that was enough.